Hello everyone, welcome. It's nice to have you here in the room.
To everybody joining us online, and I'm told there's a sizable number of you joining us online as well. Welcome to this launch of the new Democratic Audit of Australia, posing the question, is it time to renew Australian democracy? I want to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal peoples of this region, people that I have deep family connections to as well. So it's a pleasure to be able to be here and share in this space that they have cared for just for these types of events for many thousands of years. My name's Stan Grant. I'm a professor at Charles Sturt University, director of the Yinjimarra Nullaway Trust, and involved in the Democratic Audit as co-author of one of the chairs, and of course in organising this event, co-author of one of the chapters rather, and organising this event today. It's one of the critical questions of our time, isn't it? The future of democracy. Freedom House, which measures the health of democracies around the world, now count at least 16 or 17 straight years of declining democracy. We've seen eruptions in parts of Europe, in the United Kingdom, and of course in the United States. There's a greater degree of volatility in our democracies. We know that we live in times where we are having to share space with people of great difference, and we know that there are real challenges in being able to build cohesion into what are very plural, multicultural societies with enormous historical, social, economic and cultural challenges as well. How does that play out on our democracy here in Australia? These are the questions that have been posed in the Democratic Audit of Australia, looking at our social cohesion, looking at the role of our constitution, looking at our institutions, raising questions about how representative our democracy is, how it speaks to the most vulnerable, questions about justice and recognition for First Nations people as well. We're going to be discussing the health of our democracy, where some of the challenges may lie, why we are seeing, not just here in Australia but in other parts of the world, a fraying of what was largely a duopoly, people turning away from a two-party system or major parties and looking to cast their vote elsewhere. Also looking at the role that economics plays and the radicalism that we're seeing in parts of our world and how that is driving the vote and creating a greater level of polarisation. The role of the media as well is something we'll be looking at. So a lot to discuss. I want to introduce first of all one of the authors of the audit. I want to acknowledge others who worked on this as well in the room and those who are watching on today. You're going to get your chance in the room to ask questions as well, but first I'd like to introduce Professor Mark Evans to run through the audit, some of the findings, set out some of the challenges, and then we'll go to our panel discussion. Joining us on the panel today is Michelle Grattan, of course, who needs no introduction, and whose reporting has really tested and probed and challenged our democracy here in Australia for many decades. We also have with us Senator David Pocock and Allegra Spender MP, who will be looking at what they see from the inside of our democracy and the role of independence, and as we've seen a fraying of support for the two major parties in Australia. But without any further ado, let's introduce now Professor Mark Evans to run through the findings of the audit and some of the challenges that lie ahead. Mark.
Thank you, Stan. Australia's new democratic audit owes its existence to the establishment of the Democracy 2025 initiative at the Museum of Australian Democracy. It was a collaboration with the University of Canberra and the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis, and also the Democratic Audit of the United Kingdom. It's now hosted by the Yinjimarra Trust, chaired by Stan Grant at Charles Sturt University. And despite the recommendation of the Senate, no government funding for the project was forthcoming. So the audit was very dependent on the perseverance, passion, and expertise of 28 academic authors, several of which are in the room today, supported by their universities in every state and territory, who are all committed to making Australia the best democracy that it can be. So thank you for your dedication. We're also greatly in debt to our co-editor, Professor Patrick Dunleavy, and the London School of Economics Press for publishing the audit free for download from this site. Yeah? So you can publish chapter by chapter or the whole of the audit, and we couldn't find any publisher in Australia who would do that. We had to go to the London School of Economics. And this has helped us to realise our ambition of producing an audit that's designed to both trigger public debate on the quality of our democratic practice and support better civics education in Australia. So by way of introduction to the audit's findings, as you're all aware, democracies worldwide are suffering from legitimacy problems with low levels of public trust in key political institutions, the polarisation of politics, and the erosion of public confidence in the capacity of governments of whatever kind to address societal concerns. So according to the latest Edelman Trust Barometer, only 50% of people worldwide trust their governments. And the tally is even lower in many developed countries, such as the US, the United Kingdom, and as we shall see, Australia. There's also a dangerous conflation of challenges to the idea of democracy, from a political domino effect from the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, Chinese aggression in the Pacific and the South China Sea, and the failings of the superpower of democracy, the United States of America, to lead on issues of good democratic practice. And all of these challenges have been brought into sharp focus by the collapse of the rule-based international order in Gaza and the Lebanon. Democracy is in crisis, retreat, or recession in many countries worldwide. According to the Democracy Index, there are now only 24 fully functioning democracies, and we have 104 flawed and non-democracies in the world today. During the pandemic, there were 6 coups and 79 national elections suspended. Democratic backsliding across the world has become a norm. So how does Australia compare with this global pattern of democratic discontent? Well, we see a picture of a democracy in Australia under stress, but not in crisis. So first, trust in Australian political institutions is in decline here in Australia. Only 30% of Australians report trust in people in government, according to the Australian election study. And according to a range of different surveys, the main concerns driving the decline in trust are perceptions of policy bankruptcy, the lack of transparency in decision-making, public sector inefficiency, perceptions of political and administrative corruption, and the disconnection between many politicians and their constituents. Australians also express concerns about poor political communication of policies and their purpose, and the perceived failure of governments to deliver solutions to pressing issues, such as the cost of living crisis, which is basically housing, wage stagnation, and adaptation to climate change. 71% of the population believes that the country has become more divided post the Voice referendum. Second, despite this, there is strong attachment to democratic values in Australia. The 2024 World Values Survey shows that support for free and fair elections, the rule of law, and representative democracy are stronger than ever before in Australia. Democracy is not the problem. It's our politics and policy. Third, Australia is viewed internationally as a leading liberal democracy. In the 5 major global rankings, on average, Australia is ranked 12th and is classed as one of only 24 full democracies in the world. We do less well, however, on social development and inequality measurement. According to the OECD, we're 21 out of 37 countries with particular problems with protection of the vulnerable, access to property, wage stagflation, and income inequality. Fourth, what Nobel laureate Amartya Sen refers to as the protective power of democracy is under pressure. And that has 4 components. First, there's the electoral integrity component, and we do really well here. We find that Australia's elections are free and fair, thanks to our fantastic independent election commission. Second, public participation. Now, here Australia performs poorly in facilitating citizen participation beyond voting. Opportunities for civil society engagement through localism, through citizens' juries, through citizens' assemblies are limited. Localism is the Cinderella of the Australian constitutions. Parliaments at various levels are not adequately representative in terms of gender and ethnicity, apart from here, in terms of gender. And regional policy concerns are often ignored. Third, rights protection. Australia has made improvements for protecting civil rights, particularly gay rights, but there remain significant gaps in protecting the rights of the most vulnerable groups in our society, including Indigenous communities and children, differently abled people, and refugees. Australia is the only democracy in the world that lacks a comprehensive Charter of Human Rights or Bill of Rights. And then finally, good democratic governance. And the audit finds that Australian institutions are generally effective in times of crisis, as seen in responses to the bushfires, floods, and the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the federal government is the 3rd most centralised federal state in the world, after Saudi Arabia and Belgium. Particularly in terms of public finance. And this undermines traditional checks and balances. And public perceptions of corruption in politics and the public sector, particularly at the state level, is growing. So, the audit concludes that Australian democracy is not in crisis, but we do have a policy crisis that requires reflection and reinvention. To renew its democracy, Australia needs to bridge the trust divide by making the system of government more representative, accountable, collaborative, and responsive to the policy needs of citizens. A stronger focus on integrity in politics, ensuring that governments and politicians deliver tangible policy outcomes for the public. It is also time for Australia to be proactive on the regional and world stage in championing liberal democracy. As Larry Diamond puts it, coups of the officially declared sort are not generally how democracies die these days. Rather, death occurs step by step through the steady degradation of political pluralism, civil liberties, and the rule of law, until the Rubicon has been crossed, as if in a fog, without our knowing the precise moment when it happened. The key question is whether our orthodox adversarial politics have the capacity to move the dial. Thank you. Stan.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. I might just start. Is everyone hearing me okay with this microphone? Okay, I'm not getting any foldback, so I don't know how loud it is or not, but I'm glad you can hear me. I want to start with you, Michelle. Mark pointed out that there are 24 fully functioning democracies in the world. Australia is one of them. So before we get into the negativity, with so much volatility in democracy around the world, what is it that mitigates the worst of that here? What do we do well in our democracy?
Well, I think we've been a very basically cohesive society for a long time. We've got very solid institutions, legal, political, social institutions, strong community links and community institutions, and also, very importantly, we've got compulsory voting. And of course, people who are democratic libertarians, for want of a better term, would say, well, if people don't want to vote, surely it's their right. And I mean, there's a solid argument on that front. But pragmatically, compulsory voting has kept our political system driven towards the centre, and I think that that has been an absolute glue in our democracy and a very positive thing.
Mark, it can work two ways, can't it? Compulsory voting can mitigate the worst, particularly the political extremes that we see in the United States, for instance. But you've been concerned that it can also have another effect, which is a complacency, and that it may not, and it may be an impediment to change. How so?
Well, look, I should first say that I'm a champion of compulsory voting. However, there is a thesis that says that it masks discontent, right? So the countries that you're referring to, political science in those countries focuses on the problems of turnout, right, and the barriers to turnout. So that's why actually the democratic audit is really important, because it's important that we have a solid evidence base on what's working and what isn't working. Because we want the rights and responsibility, I think, of compulsory voting, but we need to be aware that that can mask discontent.
If Australia broadly is a healthy democracy, if there are so many things working for us, why are we seeing the levels of discontent, loss of trust, a loss of confidence, and we're also seeing a fraying, particularly when it comes to support for the major parties? Why are we seeing that, Mark?
Well, I think that's about the politics of the everyday. I mean,
you made a distinction between politics and policy and democracy.
Yeah.
So is this in the way politics is conducted rather than the strength of the systems and the outcomes of the systems?
yes.
So is it more? Has it got more to do with appearances or people's perceptions or the noise? And I mean, you mentioned media, for instance, as one of the things contributing to that. Is it less fundamental and foundational? Is it more optical?
I think it's partly because there's a general perception out there that governments aren't tackling the issues that everyday people care most about. So that's part of it. Then there's the perception of the dangers of adversarial politics, so the view that politicians come to Canberra to do battle rather than solve policy problems. So the argument basically is at the heart of our political tradition. There has always been a top-down, government knows best, adversarial approach to solving public policy problems. And the argument really is that the public are now moving away from that. They want to see more collaborative politics. They want to see more cleaner politics. They want governments to be more outcome-oriented, focusing on issues like, are the kids going to be able to ever afford a house, right? Are we going to be able to adapt to climate action in a way that we're not cutting off a future for our grandkids, right? Are we going to be able to afford a reasonable standard of living to actually enjoy this amazing country that we live in? And then there's also questions really around what I would call the kind of crisis of faith issue. People are looking for answers to those bigger, larger questions in terms of their lives. Some have looked away from religion for those answers and looking for other solutions, either through science or technology. Others are looking back to particular religious orientations. So there's a gap here in terms of the relationship, I think, between faith and politics as well.
Allegra hasn't left us, for anyone wondering. She's gone off to do her democratic duty and vote. So she should be applauded for that, and she'll be back here to join us soon. I want to bring David Pocock in just a minute, because you're on the, you're at ground zero, David. You're seeing where the rubber really hits the road here. But Michelle, I want to go to where some of the fault lines may lie. How much of a risk is there that the cultural issues, those highly emotive issues that certainly supercharge American politics, British politics, can take root here? We're seeing at the moment, particularly in this scourge of anti-Semitism that we've seen, of course, emotions heightened by what we've seen with the conflict in Gaza and more broadly. What sort of a stress test is that for our democracy and our social cohesion, which you mentioned is one of the hallmarks of the strength of our democracy? And what are the implications for dealing with that in a way that we don't necessarily see the deep fault lines emerge that we see in other democracies?
Well, I think that the whole conflict in the Middle East over the last year and a half has put a lot of stress on our democracy, and it's obviously very difficult to handle for governments, for communities, for those who are directly involved. And I think the wider question is how we keep together multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism...
That's a fault line throughout the world when it comes to democracy.
Well, that's right, but it's also a great strength in Australia. It's really dates from the 70s, but I was reading recently George Zabritsky's biography, one of the founders of architects of multiculturalism in Australia, who was an academic here in Canberra at the ANU, and just looking over the decades, multiculturalism has had bad times, and I think at the moment it is in one of those bad times. I think it's really important that somehow it be strengthened, and that the current Middle East conflict does not exacerbate the difficulties of a community where you embrace differences, different cultural traditions, but you also stress cohesion and unity.
Sorry, Michelle, if I could just come in there, but that is going to require self-sacrifice. It's going to require also leadership and potential government intervention that may, in fact, create its own stress and tensions for our democracy. Freedom of speech being one of them. Curbs, is there a necessity, and are there times in a democracy to curb expression that has the potential to create danger and risk for others?
Well, and of course we're seeing one of those times now, and the Parliament as we speak is debating a bill to strengthen measures against hate speech. Now, let me just say that I think that's a good thing and a necessary thing in our time, but you have to also accept that that sort of restriction, and talked about restrictions or implemented restrictions on protests and so on, do curb liberal rights, small L liberal rights. So walking that line is very difficult, and it's not the first time we've walked it. Remember a while ago when you had the Howard government strengthening all sorts of security laws, we had the same sort of debate. So people will differ legitimately about where you put lines, you put controls, but it is an important debate to have.
Hold the thought, Mark, because I want to come back to you about the question of the nexus of liberalism and democracy. There are other ways of doing democracy that don't necessarily have to be liberal. And and you're involved, for instance, in Afghanistan, where they're looking at different models of democracy. I want to park that question on. I'll come to Allegra and David. And David, I'll just bring you in and then come to Allegra. One of the things that we have seen is that support for major parties is is diminishing. And you get elected now with a primary vote with a 3 in front of it. You're not you're not getting a 4, and we'll never see a 5 again. So you're getting governments elected, and we're seeing this in the UK and other places as well. We have a preferential system, so people's votes are more broadly representative. But when there's a primary vote of 32, 33%, and you form government, and two-thirds of the country haven't made you their first choice of government, there are real strains in that. Why are we seeing this fraying of support for the duopoly of politics?
I think to Mark's point, it's that policy crisis. It's the failure to act on what everyone can see are the big issues we face as a society. Both, the big things that are out there and out of individuals' control, but then the day-to-day things around cost of living and housing, and just the disconnect between the rhetoric that we hear from politicians and then the solutions that are offered up by experts, and then what we see Parliament squabbling about but then implementing. And I mean, it's the reason I put my hand up, is I was so frustrated by looking at politicians and saying, surely we can do this better. We've got so much more in common, and 2, the solutions are there for us if we actually have the courage to implement them.
So why? It's counterintuitive, isn't it? The people want something, so we won't do what the people want. Fewer of them will vote for us. We just hope that we can get into Parliament and hold power. Why are they not responding to what you're seeing on the ground, that people are looking for answers and they're not getting them from major parties?
I mean, I'm an independent, so I can say this, and the major party politicians will disagree, but I think it's vested interests and self-interest. And what I've seen as when it comes to things around climate change and the phase out of fossil fuels, they're consistently disregarding the science because there are vested interests, powerful companies, lobby groups that are not only lobbying them, but have a very big stick and say, if you do this, just remember the super profits tax will be coming after you. And then I think there's the self-interest where at the moment, the major parties are negotiating electoral reform, which really does just entrench the duopoly. And so rather than saying, okay, well, independents are some sort of self-correcting mechanism in our democracy, where more people are saying, actually, major parties, you're not working for us, so we're going to go elsewhere. Rather than saying, okay, what do we need to do to win back your trust? Their response is, how do we lock in this system regardless of our performance? And I think that's where the kind of self-interest comes into it.
And yet we're seeing that's increasingly unsustainable, Allegra, isn't it? Because we are seeing the vote for major parties decrease. And we saw the rise of what's termed the teals that you've been grouped among yourself. What led to that? I mean, there were, for anyone paying attention, there were certainly the signs, and independents had made forays before, but for a movement, as the teals were broadly seen, that you were a part of, what created that space?
So if I think of my community,
because each community is different too.
Yeah, each community is different, and I would describe it as a small L liberal community. I'd say it's economically conservative, it's interested in long-term thinking, cares about the environment, and is socially pretty progressive and liberal. And it really felt that it had been liberal since Federation. It had one independent for 8 months, and I think it really felt that it just wasn't being represented, and the values of the community were not being represented. And instead, it was instead of being the Liberal member for Wentworth, it was basically the Liberal Party's. You weren't the community's representative in Canberra. You were the Liberal Party's representative in Wentworth, and it was a real sort of sense that party first. The previous Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said, look, our climate policy won't be determined, in the cafes and bars, of the inner city. That's the community that I'm from, and that's a community that felt unrepresented. And I think there's that sense of disconnect to, what do we care about? There is definitely something about, we have long-term issues and a real sense that we have short-term band-aids, and people are very frustrated with that. And, housing's a perfect example. This has been brewing for the last 20 years because of failure at local, state and federal levels. And we have had band-aid solutions literally for generations. And I think, at the community piece, I think you know, when I talk to my community, someone said to me on the weekend, they said, you know, we want people to find the common ground. And that, you know, Australia has a lot of common ground. In our community, we have a heap of common ground. But the incentive structure for the major parties is to minimise the common ground and to create division, because that creates contrast. So if you demonise them, you know, you look better. And so there's that incentive. And I think those are the incentives and I think it's, until now, you know, it's been hard to break that but now with new people in, I think then there's this sort of question, well, maybe we can do it a bit differently.
Mark, there's so much interesting in what Allegra just raised there, because, and you went to this as well, people feel as if their society is more divided. But politicians can't exploit division if division does not exist. So what are we really saying we want to see people reach more common ground? Or are we a more polarised society? We may say we want that, but actually we are deeply divided and we choose that division. How is that showing up in your research?
Well, there's a difference in terms of having different opinions on a specific issue and the ability to come together, work through those issues and find a way forward. Democracy isn't all about everybody getting a slice of pie. You know, there needs to be hard decisions. I mean, climate's a classic example of that. You know, while we're waiting around to see whether we can meet net zero targets, you know, our country's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. We still don't have proper canopies on our streets. I mean, these basic things that are just not happening due to lack of interest and funding. A lot of these things are now being taken up by citizens' initiatives because they've had enough of government. So this for me is much more about getting collaboration in our DNA. And that's not peculiar to Australia, of course, but it has been very noticeable through the work that we've done on the audit that the issue of the lack of collaboration comes up again and again and again and again.
Michelle, one of the other things that Allegra raised, which is critical and certainly goes to this moment, and that is the question of housing. In Australia, that seems to be the litmus test, isn't it? The distribution of real estate. The idea that you can have your own home, and a person who works hard can have their own home. To see that fraying, how much is that undermining our social fabric? In the same way that, say, the capacity for opportunity in the United States with the monopolisation of wealth in the hands of a few has undermined their social contract. The housing question, how critical is this to not the crisis, but the fraying of our democracy?
I think that housing has been really important because the so-called, quote, Australian dream of being able to have your own house has been a very important unifying factor, I think, in Australia for many decades, and that has now been set back substantially. And I also think relevant to this and to the state of democracy is that there are optimistic times and there are pessimistic times. And for example, when Australia came out of World War II and we had an economy that was growing, more and more people were getting into houses. We were able to absorb a lot of immigrants because there were jobs, there were more opportunities. Keeping that cohesion is always easier in optimistic times and times of economic well-being, harder when the economy is not going so well. And also, of course, we are at the moment, and have been for quite a while, been in the era of political grievance. So our politicians sell the negatives, they don't sell so much the positives. And I think, again, that strains democracy. So if you remember or read about the Whitlam period, for example, Whitlam came in on at a very positive time and on a positive platform. Times were changing. Other politicians come in on negative platforms and in negative times, and that leads to more fraying.
David, this raises, I want to come to some audience questions, so get your questions together. I'll be coming to you in just a moment. But David, this goes to some point that you made before, and that is the lack of policy ambition, or there's a maybe not cowardice is the right word, but there's people are less prone to want to really embrace policy change. Housing is one area, isn't it? I mean, you said before there are things that can be done, but they're not being done. What would it take to open up the housing situation? Bill Shorten, when he lost what some saw as an unlosable election, had an ambitious agenda to try to open up housing and remove the sort of investment incentives that can create the disparities. What is required? And is that one area that we're not seeing the policy courage?
We're absolutely not seeing it, I think, for a variety of reasons. John Howard said he'd never heard anyone complain about the value of their house going up. And we're in a situation where 60% of people either own a home or have a mortgage on a home. And so to start to talk about how do we deal with this system, and it's potentially going to take house prices not increasing for 15 to 20 years while wages keep up, to go back to what we had in the 90s, where it was more affordable. And to do that, you've got to start to look at our tax system. And I think once you just start to jump into the weeds, you open yourself up to this just cacophony of different views on negative gearing and capital gains tax. Every time I speak about it, I try and start with the question, what is housing for? What is housing for as a society? Is this something that is so fundamental as a human to have a safe home? And without that, you basically can't flourish. Is it a human right, or is it an investment vehicle? Because currently it's set up as an investment vehicle. So the system is working according to plan. It's working according to how we set up our tax system. And if we want to go back to the human right part, we've got to make some big changes. And I think once you can start to talk to people about what this actually means for our society and the future of our society, people are actually willing to make sacrifices. But I think so quickly I've seen, the Senate just descends into, you need to rule this out, rule that out, without actually having a debate about what are we here for? We're here to actually make Australians' lives better and look to the future and solve some of these big problems.
Allegra, are people, again, we talked this before, that people have their various grievances and it's different from one area to another. But in your area, which is fair to say is fairly well heeled and people have benefited from the increase in property prices, are they as willing to give up their own, their own good fortune, their own investments for the benefit of others?
I think, so firstly, it's easy to make assumptions about my area. 45% of my community rents, 60% are in apartments. And so while people are relatively well off, we have really high kind of levels of mortgage stress because it's so expensive. So, so there, and I guess that's true of all of us. Like, our lives are always more complex than people give credit for. But I do think that there is a real, but in that community there is enormous concern about housing and opportunity for each generation, and
their children, and
their
that's
kids.
where it bites.
It is
isn't
their
it?
kids and it's their grandkids, and also because a lot of people are going, well, look, I was lucky, I bought my house in 1980. My kids are never going to have opportunities like me. So I said, like, even in areas which, like mine, is a well-off area, there's more nuance and there's more variety of people's circumstances. I think that it's actually building the empathy that is what we need to do. And, I know one of the points that you guys make is citizens' assemblies. It's something I've been pushing from at the very start of my term, to say we need citizens' assemblies around housing. We need actually empathetic engagement around housing and different people telling their stories and experiences, because it's only once we start to engage in the empathy will, I think, we deal with some of the difficult questions. Because it's hard, my area is being pushed to have more density. People are scared about loss of views, loss of value, loss of sunlight, and these are, and then they're not trivial concerns. They are, sincere concerns, and all these things have to be balanced if you're going to, we need to deal with supply as a key part of housing. And we've got to find ways to negotiate that and to engage people in that, and in an appropriate way. And so, we did some housing summits, and what we did was we brought 100, 150 people together, but we tried to get people in groups of 10 and talk about their own experiences. Because I think if you're talking to somebody about the fact that, you're a nurse, your work is here, you have to travel an hour and a half to get here every day, and you don't build connection, with the people you're caring for, that does create the empathy for people to go, well, maybe I need to give something up. So I think, but I think, more broadly, there's this great book I'd recommend to everyone called The Great Experiment, How You Make Diverse Democracies Work, which is excellent and talks about diversity and democracy. But one of the things they say is that, we need social inclusiveness in terms of economic inclusivity, for people to feel like they've got a stake and got an opportunity. And I do think what's happened in the US and can happen here, and it's about housing, but it's actually just about more that it's the fact that people feel, my kid's going to be better off.
Well, the social contract's broken,
the social
covenant,
contract. That sense that, if I, exactly as you said, if I work hard, I don't need to be the CEO, Australia will give me a decent life. And I think we are really fraying on that. And it's about house prices, but it's just about actually the economic stress on people. So I think we do have some real problems there.
I'd like to take some questions from the audience. If you do have a question, we have microphones that are roaming around. There's one right up here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to ask the panel about the role of the media in democracy.
You've read my mind. That was just where we were about to go.
It seems they've moved from holding governments to account to more one of promoting a particular line, often a particularly toxic line. So I just ask the panel what their views are of the modern media.
We've got one of the doyens of the press gallery here for many, many years, Michelle Grattan. Michelle, we've also seen the blurred lines between what is comment, opinion, and what is news. And we've seen, as we've seen in the United States, an increasing partisanship. I mean, we've always had robust publishers who've taken a political view. But one of the things that the audit does show is that collapse of trust in the media is part of what they see as the malaise of democracy. Where's the media going wrong, and what can be done to arrest that?
Well, I'll be interested to hear what the politicians say about this too. But I think that what we've seen, of course, is the growth of social media, and that has been enormously important in what's happening to the media at the moment. That obviously has its pluses, but it does have minuses too, and they're pretty large. It has led to a more toxic political culture, and I think any politician would probably agree with that assessment. In terms of the media more generally, I think it's not in a good state at the moment. It's good to have a diversity of view widely across the spectrum, but again, we see the negative side of that diversity where a lot of the media is just shouty at the moment, and I think that contributes to a very negative political debate. It also contributes to an anything goes atmosphere that you can just say what you like. In some media outlets, there are not the restraints that there might have been in other times. But again, as you say, we shouldn't forget that we've had media that were players, that were shouty and so on in times past. It's not an entirely new thing, but the scale of it and the intensity of it, and the fact that social media is there and charges it, I think is new.
I will get a view from David and Allegra on this. You deal with the media, and where do you see those challenges lying? Part of the media's DNA is to generate conflict, isn't it? It's to polarise things and find the extremes of an argument and then let people sort of go at it. But as a politician trying to traverse this right now, and when you see concern about greater division, what role is the media playing, Allegra?
I don't think it is always playing a constructive role, I'll be honest. And I use an example, yesterday, both houses of Parliament passed unanimously a motion condemning anti-Semitism, and that's particularly relevant to my community because a lot of the anti-Semitic attacks have been in my community. That got much less coverage in the media, certainly in the papers today, including papers that have really been worried about anti-Semitism than almost anything else. And so that was it, but it was common ground. And I think, it bleeds, it leads. I think that's always been a challenge of the media, but I do think that's, the media does thrive on conflict. And so, when people do come together, it's not as newsworthy because it's not as much conflict. But I think we do have, the media's, its business model's fundamentally changed in the last 20 years and it hasn't caught up. And I think that's the piece. It's, how to run profitable news and high quality, and is there a role and an increasing role for government to play in terms of some sort of funding to help shore up quality media? I think this is a conversation we are in the middle of, as opposed to we have found an answer to, I'll be honest.
And you touched on this before, David. You talked about social media and the impact that that's having as well. How much does that distort the picture as well right now, from your experience?
Well, I think it's added another layer where, from what I've seen, some of my biggest frustrations with media generally has been just the lack of ability to actually have a nuanced argument or put anything nuanced forward, because it has to be, binary. It's either this or it's that. And then you actually see journalists, how hard they work, how much pressure they're under just to file something, move on to the next thing, and are judged on clicks or virality on social media. So the incentives are not
the business model, as you mentioned, yeah.
And so I think, we clearly have a big problem with media concentration in Australia. That's no secret. We need more diversity, but how do we do that? And we now have these tech giants that are hoovering up all of our data and the media stories, making huge money, and certainly in Australia, just shifting that overseas, basically paying no tax because our parent company, we owe them, a few $1 billion. So I think we should be looking to tap them on the shoulder and say, your business model is based on all of our data, including the media's stories. How do we take some of that and actually build the media back up?
Another question? Yes.
No one's talked about the problem created by lack of truth in political advertising. And I think this is something that the press has not called out either.
Mark?
Well, certainly when we looked at the issue of electoral integrity and we looked at international assessments of our elections, that was a big issue. So the view was that that incumbent governments were using their position to advertise the success of their policies in the run-up to elections, and this was giving incumbents unfair advantage. And certainly our view is that that's an issue of serious concern that we need to
Did it
look
show
at.
up a lot in the research? How front of mind is it? Or people going to more, the issues that are front and centre for them, cost of living, housing, social cohesion? What was it something that really showed up a lot in the research?
We're going to this significance issue of. Look, in the context of that audit, the view was, yes, we have free and fair elections on all of the key indices of democratisation, but this is a problem, clearly, and the two parties, you know, what's in it for them to actually provide a check and balance on that, you know? So a lot of the issues that were raised in that area were really around the two-party duopoly and how you provide a fair go for independents or new parties.
Another question from the audience? Yeah, just the back.
Thank you, and thank you, Stan, for your beautiful recent book.
Oh, thank you very much.
And thank you,
It's worth
panel,
the
for your
plug.
thoughtfulness. My question is, as per the example from yesterday of the anti-Semitism common ground vote, what would it take for this in the next fortnight of this Parliament for there to be an agreement, bipartisan, across the parties agreement, to come up with, complex as it is, a national plan to prevent further catastrophic climate change?
Wow. Will I go out on a limb and say unlikely, David?
It would take some leadership. Yeah, I mean, it's the issue that we're all going to be judged on long after we're gone, and it can be pretty tough being in there and just seeing what is being talked about when we know what we're heading into. One of the things I've been thinking about and working on is how do you actually change the way that we make decisions. We're so short term, and you know, in many ways, you can see why governments make those decisions, because it's really about how do I win on this election date and stay here. And you can justify that any way you want and say, well, they're terrible, and so we need to do whatever we can to get re-elected, and then we'll do some really good stuff. I've got a bill that would legislate a duty of care to young people where we actually have to lift our eyes a bit, and when we're going to assess and approve a fossil fuel project, to actually say, well, how's this going to affect young Australians, unborn Australians? And you know, I think we've got so much to learn as a sort of new colonial culture about how do you make decisions like you're here for a long time. And you know, Stan, you've got so many great things to say about this, obviously, but I think that's where we're at.
Just to add to that, look, I think chances zilch in the next fortnight, but it's a great frustration for me, because I think after the last election, particularly the coalition had a choice. It could have said, you know what, take climate off the agenda as the ground on which we are going to fight, and it chose not to. And I find that extremely disappointing, you know, because of environmental and economic reasons. I think it's the wrong choice, and that's you know, devastatingly bad. In terms of how do we get to that? It's interesting. I've done quite a lot of work on tax, and you know, I've spent a lot of time with Ken Henry, and who, you know, wrote, you know, probably the definitive tax review of sort of the last 20 years. And we've talked a lot about sort of the challenge on this is you've got expertise, but how do you translate that into community support? And this is where I think that, you know, the challenge of the Henry review was, it was wonderful, you know, it's a great report, but it was delivered, and then, you know, and there wasn't community engagement through it. The experts basically said this is what we should do, and it was up to politicians to kind of deliver it, and then they lost hope. You know, we need to find different ways of bringing communities through the decision making, because if you can get communities to pressure politicians, that's your best chance of making change. Like, it is community pressure that forces change, and I think, you know, that's why that's why I was voted in. You know, that's why I think we have seen this splitting of people out. But I think the fundamental question is, how can we better engage our communities to force more of that common ground? Because I think that's our greatest hope in terms of making better long-term decisions. And then what are the institutional structures, whether it be longer terms, whether it be, you know, better committee structures, you know, different question time. What are some institutional structures that can also help, you know, create a parliament that is more accountable to the people?
Michelle, I'll ask you a question about this, because it goes to the broader question of reform more generally, I suppose, as well. But when something appears to be in all of our interest, when something appears to be so pressing, why has it been so heavily politicised, and why has it been so easy in some ways to turn this into a political football, to turn this into a culture war issue? And we're seeing it again now around questions of nuclear. It appears to me it's less about whether nuclear is an option and more about the politics of it and the capacity to turn that into some sort of a culture war issue.
Well, I think that on this question of climate, there are, or there have been, less now probably, but there have been obviously differences of view. Now you can say that some of these views are obviously wrong in most people's opinion, but nevertheless there were divisions over the whole range of climate issues. So that's one thing. Another thing is that economic interests are involved here. So there's the whole question of the fossil fuel industry, the profitability or not profitability of that. There are also questions about how change impacts communities, consumers and so on. And of course, economic considerations will also be important. And thirdly, there's the political issue that politicians can just have and can exploit this issue by saying you're going to be worse off, or things are going to lead to a whole lot of long-term costs. So you have these various levels, differences, and a nuclear one is a difference about both the economics of it and the general viability. So in that case, it's sort of a layered issue, as it were. But you've got the actual differences, the economic differences, and the chance for exploiting an issue, and all that ends up in a culture war economic debate.
We're almost out of time and Allegra has to go, so I do want to just come to you, Mark, for one final comment in just a minute, but quickly to Allegra and David. You've come in from the outside, so to speak, independence in a fraying sort of two-party system. Your experience of being in politics, has it made you more disenchanted? Do you think you are making the difference that you sought to make by coming into Parliament? Allegra and then David.
Look, I have had more joy in this job at a personal level than I've had in any other job, so I think it is a wonderful role. And I think, some days you have good days, sometimes you have bad days, but certainly I believe that I am making the difference, both in terms of the what and the how, because this is about the changes you want to make in terms of climate. Now, we're not where we need to be, but we're actually pointing in the right direction. Now the job is to keep on going. But it's also the how. I do think people want to see politics done differently, and that's part of the job. So, but I'm learning every day, and so hopefully I'll get better at it too. Like genuinely, like I do want to keep on getting better, I guess is how I'd say.
David?
I'm far more optimistic about politics and our political system than I was before I became a senator. And the thing I say to young people is that you can look at it and say, well, they're a bunch of crooks and get cynical and check out. Or you can say, well, we've got the scaffolding of a great democracy. It's not perfect. And if you love this place we live, if you love Australia, love this continent, then get involved and let's make this better. And we have so many of the solutions to, I think, improve our democratic process and the way that we set the rules of engagement for politicians that will then, I think, allow them to actually start to deal with some of these issues. So, yeah, I've been really inspired by people like Helen Haynes, other independents, who I think have really been trailblazers of a different way of doing politics.
Good. And Mark, just a final word from you about taking the strengths of our democracy, and we've seen where some of the fault lines lie and where some of the stresses are, but it's not a democracy in crisis, as we'd say others were. Australia is an extraordinary place, and, with the issues notwithstanding, it is a remarkable place. Are we talking about a policy and a politics problem rather than a democracy problem? And what can be done then, if that is the case, to strengthen it?
I think we are. We are looking at a policy and politics problem. I think it is about finding new ways of doing politics. We have great bones in our democracy, as my grandmother would say. But we need to be more imaginative. And we need to stand up for democracy in the world more broadly. Democracy is really under threat worldwide right? So the idea that
And sometimes by democracies themselves.
exactly. So the idea that we can sit here all complacent in Australia and say, well, you know, we've got a pretty decent deal here, that's a big problem. We can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
Yes, we don't have the same existential threats at the moment than, you know, the US or the UK, but that could change very, very quickly. You know, the geopolitics could change very, very quickly. So my major concern is that we put our house in order, we're more imaginative, we're more inclusive and participatory in our democracy, right? And we ensure that our politicians, and we have two great examples here, do what they're supposed to do on the tin of liberal democracy. And that is speak truth to power, be responsive to their constituencies, and engage effectively in public policy debate.
And the audit is a good place to start if you want to look at where those stresses are, where the strengths are, and where the challenges lie, and the opportunities to make our democracy better. I'd suggest that you read it. Thank you to everyone who is involved here, and thanks to our politicians who've taken time out of their very busy days to do this. And Allegra has to run, don't you? Right on 1:30.
I've been asked to do a selfie before we do that.
Okay, thank you. Please thank everyone. Thank you as well for your participation.